Hello, and welcome to Food for You and the Planet, a fresh new podcast that explores healthy and environmentally sustainable food solutions. This podcast is brought to you by Healthy Plan Eat Online Farmers Market. I'm Dr. Rosemary Ostfeld, and I'm your host. Together, we'll hear from leaders in environmental science, agriculture, medicine, nutrition, entrepreneurship, and more. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to hear all the latest in healthy and sustainable food with Food for You and the Planet. Today's episode features Professor David Montgomery and Anne Biklé. David and Anne are Dig to Grow, a husband and wife and a pair of writers. David Montgomery is an Earth and Space Science professor at the University of Washington. He is a geomorphologist who looks at the process shaping Earth's surface and how they affect ecological systems and human societies. His book, Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life, focuses on the potential for regenerative farming practices to reshape agriculture. He is an elected fellow of the American Geophysical Union and has received many awards throughout his career, including a MacArthur Fellowship and the Vega Medal. Anne Biklé attended the University of California, Santa Cruz, earning bachelor's degrees in biology and natural history. She holds a master's degree in landscape architecture from the University of California, Berkeley. She has over 2 decades of professional experience spanning field biology, watershed restoration, environmental planning, and public health. She uses her broad background and endless fascination with the natural world to examine connections between people and their environments. Thank you so much for being here today.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here with you, Rosemary.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So we'll start off. I would love to hear a little bit about both of your careers and your work on soil.
Well, I'm a geologist by background and training, and so I sort of came to working on soils in a very backwards way for someone who's now writing a lot about agriculture, and that's I started looking at how soil erosion works and how it shapes natural landscapes, and that led me into thinking about, well, how does soil actually form? How do you lose it? How do you build it? In natural systems, and then I started looking into how people influence and change that. And farms are where the real action is in terms of that. I mean, there's a lot of erosion that people cause in the world, but the area that's really central to our future is essentially what's happening on the world's farms. So the more I looked into the state of the world's soils and what we've been doing to them as a means of feeding ourselves, the more concerned I got with the degradation that's happened in the past. And the farther I got into it, the more optimistic I became that we can actually fix those problems and that there are ways to farm to produce enough food to feed us all and actually improve biodiversity and environmental conditions on farms. So I sort of came through a long journey in thinking about it, and Anne's been my partner on most of that journey because she, as she will tell you, is a biologist and has a very different perspective on this that is very um, um, complementary to my background.
Wow, Rosemary, you read that little bit about us, and I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, oh yeah. So, I mean, I'll just add a little bit. In addition to everything that you just went over, I'm also a very hands-on person, and I think that is probably in large part what drew me to biology and natural history and botanizing and birding and all of that stuff is because when you get outside and you start looking at things, especially things you can see and pick up and everything, it is just sort of an endless, as you said, an endless place to go and be fascinated by. And that is definitely the case with me. And I really, I guess I kind of consider myself really kind of more of a free range biologist than any one type. And that probably has to do with my training in the environmental field, which is anytime you dip into that, you start, and a lot of that field is about how do we fix the environment? How do we restore it? How do we be less hard on it? it's always a big tangled mess of threads because one thing is connected to another, to another, to another. And so with that training and being a biologist, that, naturally enough, it led me into, and also liking to do things with my hands, that led into gardening. And that led into soil. And what is this stuff underneath anyway? And how much should I be concerned about it? I'm in love with plants, not the soil. And then, well, anybody who's tried to grow any kind of plant, probably even, a little old house plant, you start to get interested in soil because that's the home of your plant. It's the home of your garden, the home of your farm. And so one thing, leads to another, and then here I am, kind of knee deep and more in soil, and it's a big rabbit hole. Anybody who might choose to go down it, I'm sure will find lots of interesting side alleys, and yeah, so have at it.
That's great. So you touched on it a little bit, but why is soil so important for our food systems and society as a whole?
Well, most of our food comes from the soil, directly or indirectly. Something like I've seen various estimates of 90% plus, up to like 98% at the high end. So most of our food is grown through the soil. And when you think about the sort of the unique capacities of Earth as a planet in this universe, it's the only place we know of that actually has soil, and that's really the marriage of geology and biology, where the inanimate world of rocks mixes with the living world, and the living world needs a whole lot of stuff that's in those rocks. And we can't eat rocks, right? We need plants to eat them for us, so we can then eat the plants or the things that ate the plants. So soil, as Anna was saying, is the home of plants, and it's really where a lot of the transformation of the elements we need to build our bodies out of the systems we can't get at, the geology, that a lot of the transformations happen in the soil. And the why are soils and maintaining healthy, fertile soils important for society as a whole? Kind of boils down to whether the future will have enough to eat. And we need to be able to sustain our ability to produce food, and that really depends on the health and fertility of the land. And it turns out that a lot of practices that we have developed in terms of farming have degraded the ability of the land to support future generations. And I wrote a book, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, that sort of looked into the back history of that. And there's a long history of people degrading land. There's a long history of people taking good care of their land too, but there's a lot of examples of societies that undermined their longevity by degrading their soils. And the state of soils globally today is such that we're at risk of repeating that lesson at a global scale rather than the regional scales that I wrote about 15 years ago. And so there's a very real urgency to the problem of thinking about restoring health and fertility to the world's agricultural lands. But the problem is it's urgent in a geological sense, in the sense that we really need to address this over the next century. But in a policy world, that's like forever. That's sort of getting into geologic time in a way. And so there's this challenge that degrading land actually takes some time, and restoring it could take some time. But I've come around to being very optimistic that we could restore fertility to the world's agricultural lands remarkably fast, at least remarkably the way a geologist thinks about it. And the key, it turns out, is in Anne's area. It's in the biology. It's in restoring life to the soil. And that's the subtitle of the Growing a Revolution book, Bringing Our Soils Back to Life, or Bringing Life Back to Our Soils. And I could talk till midnight about the connections on all that. But basically, healthy soil is the foundation for a healthy civilization.
What are some of the examples that you could share about how some societies have, I guess, fallen apart when they haven't taken good care of their soil? Could you both share some examples of when that's happened and some of maybe the lessons we can learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the right way to look at it is thinking about how soil degradation, both the loss of the soil through erosion of the soil and degradation of its fertility, mostly through the loss of organic matter and beneficial soil life. Um, those are things that have undercut societies. They didn't actually destroy societies in and of themselves, but you can think of it as I like to think of it as setting the long wavelength periodicity to the rise and fall of civilizations. That if you have few people and a lot of healthy land, you're prone to build. If you have a lot of people and your land's very degraded, you're scrambling to feed everybody. And that leaves you vulnerable to things like a shift in the climate, a drought, for example, like happened in a few dynasties in ancient Egypt. Erosion helped to take out the heartland of the Roman Empire and classical Greece ahead of that, Angkor Wat. There's lots of examples from around the world. It's actually much harder to find examples of societies that supported large and growing populations for more than 1,000 years, say, with agricultural practices that degraded their land.
Yeah, and I think it's really the other thing about sort of any long-running environmental problem, there's never any one factor. And so, these different
Right.
civilizations around the world, whether you're talking about the Maya or people who lived on Easter Island, uh, all of these places are different. And so something changes, about sort of the basic way in which they're farming. And, typically that's some kind of perturbation or disruption in the natural world. As David mentioned, drought is one of those things. We're sort of facing that here in the Western US. And then that's kind of the first domino that tips into these, other areas that then eventually really compromise a society's ability to farm and feed everybody. So it's that's kind of, I don't know, in a very big picture way, how past societies have kind of done themselves in. And as Dave also mentioned, this is happening so slowly, so that it's like, oh, the soil looks pretty good out there today. Hey, let's get out there and, get farming, right? And any one generation or any single farmer, typically, unless maybe they lived through the Dust Bowl, they don't see what is happening. And so you think, yeah, we're farming okay today, looks good out there, no problems, no need to change. But then some disaster comes along, and it can change, what you think and whether you're still there.
And one of the things that I learned in writing Dirt was that one of the big agents of change in the soil has actually been tillage, the act of plowing. And when most of us sort of lay people think about what do farmers do, plowing is near the top of the list, right? It's iconic, and there's good reasons that farmers will plow. It's great weed control. You can get a little burst of fertility out of it. But if you keep doing it too often for too long, as many societies have in the past, it can cause the loss of the soil itself through erosion. Because, how many natural landscapes have you been in where you see, like whole fields full of bare earth? No, nature clothes herself in plants. And there's good reasons for that we could wax long and philosophical about. But frequent tillage basically leaves the soil vulnerable to erosion, whether by wind or rain, depending on what kind of an environment you're in. And if that happens long enough and often enough, you can literally erode the topsoil off the landscape, like happened in areas of Syria, for example, where there's records of great tax records of Roman harvests of wheat in places where the people can barely feed themselves today because the soil is literally gone. And the other part of soil degradation is the loss of soil organic matter, and tillage, plowing, actually burns up, in a way, soil organic matter much faster than it can be rebuilt. So the challenge of sustainable agriculture is really how to keep the soil on the land and keep the life and the organic matter in the soil. And it turns out that the recipe for doing that is not what many societies have done in the past, and it's not what conventional farming is doing today. We need to think differently about the land to basically be able to do that.
That's great. So as we're thinking a little bit differently about the land and how we're interacting with it, and what are some perspectives or ways we can think about our landscape and perhaps like the landscape architecture side of things that you've explored through your background?
Yeah. I think once you understand how things work, you then can begin to kind of form your activities or modify your activities around that. And certainly sort of my area of landscape architecture was environmental planning, and it's a field that asks the question of, we have all of these land uses, as a part of human society. We have farming, we have schools, we have this and that. And it's really a matter of looking at what's the capacity of the land to do this thing that we want to on this piece of land or in this area. And so, when all things are great and working well, that means that you've got your farmland, in the right place, you've got your cities in the right place, and so on. And with respect to farming in particular, one of the other things to ask about, how does the land work and is this a good place, for this farm and these activities, is you start to learn about, David, mentioned this, soil fertility. Where is that coming from? And how is this thing called plowing? How is that affecting the function of the land to do this thing we want, grow our food? And that, you kind of get it down to that sort of basic level. And then you begin asking questions like, can we do this better? Or, this land isn't functioning like it used to, or like we thought it might. And that, quickly takes you down into the world of, well, okay, if we want to know how the land works, where did all the soil fertility come from? What about all the nutrient cycling and the microbes and the organic matter and so on? And that, that is we're in a very different place with respect to how much more we know and understand about how the land works, and specifically how soils and agricultural systems work. And a better place, definitely, in terms of knowledge. I don't think our practices have caught up with everything we know, but I'm hopeful that, we're headed in that direction, at least in some places.
Thank you. And so for the book, Growing a Revolution, a lot of those topics are explored, some of the ways that we can start to improve soil health. So what are some of the key takeaways from Growing a Revolution, and what are some of the most fascinating examples from the farms that you explored all around the world?
I visited farms in equatorial Africa, Central America, and across North America. Basically visiting farms that had restored fertility to their land in much the same way that Anne's gardening, that she can tell you about, basically restored fertility to our yard and opened our eyes to the power of microbial life, that whole hidden half of nature in the soil, to rebuild soil fertility really fast. And I had met farmers out at farming conferences talking about the long-term, the civilization kind of scale stories of the past, the more geologically oriented stuff that I started with. And I started to meet farmers who had done remarkable jobs at restoring fertility to their land. And so I took it on as my job is to try and interview a number of them and figure out, well, what are the commonalities here? Because, these range from small subsistence farms in equatorial Africa to really large mechanized operations in the plains, in the Midwestern plains of the Western plains in the U.S. And what we basically found was that there was the common elements were that the farming practices that these farmers followed adhered to three fairly simple principles. Their individual practices were fairly different because, as you might imagine, the technology available to a subsistence farmer in Ghana is very different than the technology available to a rancher in the Dakotas. But the principles they followed were actually pretty similar, and that was minimizing the physical and chemical disturbance of the soil, so minimizing disturbance, maximizing and that basically translates into either no-till or low-till. So stop plowing regularly. And that's not to say that one couldn't ever plow or till with to get rid of weeds at one time. But doing it all the time on a regular basis is very detrimental to the soil over the long run. So minimizing disturbance and then maximizing the time that living roots are in the soil, basically keeping the ground covered with, so if you're not growing a cash crop, grow a cover crop. Or keep things growing in between the rows of your cash crops. And so there's obviously different ways to do that depending on what you're growing. And then grow a diversity of crops. So that sort of minimize disturbance, cover up with cover crops, and grow a diversity of crops, whether in rotations or in one's commercial crops. That's really the recipe for building healthy, fertile soils. And it's because that's a recipe for cultivating beneficial life in the soil. You don't disturb their home, you feed them with organic matter, and you give them a diverse community to work with. And you think about, what does it take to make a successful human society? Oh yeah, stable place to live, food, and colleagues, company, people to interact with, so we're not all having to do everything all for ourselves. It's a simple recipe, and it applies in the soil as well. And that also happens to be just about the opposite of how we've taught people to farm for the last 100 years, where we've encouraged, extreme mechanization, lots of tillage, the overuse of agrochemicals, and specializing in one or two crops, very simple crop rotations as opposed to diverse, complex crop rotations. So there's a very simple message from Growing Revolution that we need to think about the soil differently and treat it differently. And the optimistic part of that message is that the farmers that I found that had adopted practices that followed those principles were able to, the conventional farmers that adopted those principles, because many regenerative or like biodynamic farmers, they already practice most of that already. So of the conventional farmers I visited, the ones who had adopted practices based on these principles were able to greatly reduce their use of nitrogen fertilizers by anywhere from 50 to 90%. And actually some completely weaned themselves off of them. They greatly reduced their use of pesticides, particularly herbicides, which they had been using to control weeds. And they also were more profitable than their conventional neighbors, because why? They spent less on chemicals and diesel and fertilizer, and they were able to harvest, almost as much, if not a little more, than their conventional neighbors, especially once they restored their soil. So if you're spending less to harvest about the same amount, that's a recipe for a better bottom line. And that's what really turned me into an optimist on this issue, because I think that this is one area where environmental interests and economic interests are actually starting to line up, and that's a recipe for powerful, positive social change. And that's the optimistic message here. And a lot of the reasons for that are really not so much in the geological world, but they're in the biological world and how that interfaces with the soil.
I love that. That's really great. And I think just that idea of moving away from synthetic pesticides, synthetic herbicides, synthetic fertilizers. Could you tell me a little bit more about how, when we move away from those things, we can actually improve the soil biology and help improve life in our soil ecosystems?
Sure. You want to do that one, or you want me to do that one?
Yeah. So what we really know about those kinds of inputs has been informed by how much we've been learning about the soil microbiome and the crop microbiome. So the microbiome, say, of a crop, it's not just, any old, clump of bacteria. It's these communities of microorganisms in the soil that plants actively recruit to an area right around their root systems. And what we've been learning about microbiomes is, severalfold. They are absolutely supposed to be there. They're indigenous to their host, so meaning crops, even though these plants are domesticated, they've got a genome that it's what's called, certain parts of it that are what's called conserved. And that means that these parts of the plant genome are so important that we will probably never ever find a plant that doesn't have, these key parts. And one of these key parts of the genome it produces what are called exudates. So this is plants that are using their power to photosynthesize, and then they're manufacturing nutrients, actually, like carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and they're mixing them up into these cocktails, and they're flowing out of the roots to feed, guess who? The microbiome. So this is part of the you know, the botanical world had all this stuff figured out long, long before any farmer or gardener showed up. This is how our planet, initially, was colonized by plants. It was these partnerships that plants were striking up with microbes, with fungi, with bacteria, with archaea, with all kinds of organisms down there in the soil. And the big power of that is that these plants are stuck in place. They can't not be getting up out of the soil, walking down to the coffee shop or the restaurant, into the kitchen. There is none of that. None. So they are wholly reliant on their microbiome for many things. And what we know about this, and it loops back to fertilizers and pesticides, is that in order for that partnership to function, and so for the exudates to get out, for the microbes to go, I love these exudates, I'm going to give my plant host some things in return. Like I'm going to go I'm fungi, I'm going to go fetch some phosphorus out there in the soil, transport it back, hand it off. I'm getting some exudates for that. There's one of the most specialized kinds of bacteria are our nitrogen fixers. So they are like the wizards of the the chemistry world, in a way, inside of a plant. They have the ability to take all this nitrogen that's in a gas form in the atmosphere and do all their stuff, and then it comes into a form that plants can take up. Plants do not have that chemical wizardry. They just don't. And they rely on their nitrogen fixing bacteria for this. So what might happen if you've got all of this molecular signaling, you've got these long running evolutionary partnerships that, by the way, far exceed those between plants and pollinators. And then we come and we throw a bunch of chemicals on the soil, all over the plant. It's pretty disruptive. And mostly what it does is it's like jamming a monkey wrench into this exudate for nutrients partnership. And so that is the first kind of a problem. You stop feeding exudates to the members of the microbiome, and they're like, I'm out of here. I'm not getting anything, and I need to have nourishment in order to survive. And so they stop fetching the phosphorus. They stop fixing nitrogen. And it's not just those two nutrients, which happen to be very important. They're essential for crop growth. But we also know that microbiomes manufacture an awful lot of metabolites with their own microbial genomes. And so these are molecules and compounds, one type of which are plant growth promoting hormones. So microbes are feeding growth hormones to the plants. And when that gets scuttled, and when that gets, heavily perturbed, it kind of leaves plants high and dry with respect to two really key things. And that is acquiring enough nutrients, to grow and set seed and so forth. But more fundamentally, probably at least as serious, is that it really shuts down the plant defensive system. And so this is the big problem with agriculture, is that many of the practices that are related to synthetic inputs, both fertilizers and all of the pesticides, they scramble the plant defensive system, and then you've turned what is actually quite a formidable piece of biology out there in a field, the plant, you turn it into a sitting duck. And we all know from more familiar examples, for example, the way a predator can easily pick out the weakest or most unhealthy animal in a flock, or a herd or something like that, and zoom, it's right where that predator goes. This is what pests and pathogens that are a part of agriculture are doing. they can see these crops, these sick, defenseless crops from, a long ways away or right in front of them. And they're like, great, I've got meals for a lifetime, me and all my progeny. Munch, munch, munch. And then income, not surprisingly, farmers are like, we need yields. We have got to do something about this situation. And so then you get the carpet bombing of the natural world through, insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, and all the rest. So that's sort of the big, the nutshell on the problem with agricultural systems that are heavily reliant on inputs. Now, it's not to say you should never use inputs, but we need to be far, far smarter and more judicious with how we are using these products.
That's definitely really important. I think a lot of people realize that our agriculture system is nowadays filled with a lot of chemicals. So in this next part of the podcast, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your book, The Hidden Half of Nature. So what role do microbes play? You already talked a little bit about the soil side, but what about the human side?
Yeah.
What role do they play in both soil and human health?
Yeah, this was the really eye-opening part of The Hidden Half of Nature for both Dave and I. That book is really, it really provides the insights and, even maybe a cure for what we can do about ailing soils. And an awful lot of us have ailing guts as well. And it's not just, sort of the occasional stomach ache. There's everything that is there in the sense of that word. But our gut, in many ways, is a really underappreciated organ. It's all of the time. In fact, it's a bit like, the rhizosphere, this area around the roots of a plant, in which so much of the activity there that is consequential for plant health, that same parallel carries over to the human world. And so the lion's share of the human microbiome is in our gut and in the lower reaches of our gut at that. It's not up in the stomach or the middle reaches. It's what I call in the basement, the place we never want to talk about, the colon. But that's where most of our microbiome is. And another parallel with the farming soil world is that these organisms must be nourished. And they do best on their preferred diet, which, by the way, anyone could probably guess, it's not a bunch of ultra-processed foods. In fact, those kinds of things that don't really even make it down to the colon. What the human microbiome really loves is fiber. They are able to ferment that in their habitat down in our basement, and they then, after they're nourished from that, they're also producing all kinds of metabolites and compounds that their host, me, you, everybody listening to this podcast gets, which are these, compounds and molecules that frankly have a lot of medicinal value. And this is super important for us because this whole, modern life has been great. It's given us drugs, it's given us cars and lights and all of that, but we actually haven't been living our modern lives for all that long when you consider the whole time span of human evolution, which is, several 200,000 years, let's call it. And so long before modern life, all we had was our diet and our microbiome, and that's the same with the botanical world. They had their diet, everything they could make through photosynthesis, and they had all of those wonderful microbes down in the soil. So what we know is that the diet for microbiomes is really critically important for their host, whether a person or a plant. And in The Hidden Half of Nature, these were the epiphanies and the things that we were discovering. And in building a garden, I really began, I came around to, being in love with all of my plants, to being in love with what is the microbiome all of my plants eating, because that was what was going to give me what I was really after, which was really healthy plants, really good looking plants, plants that people, me, Dave, friends would come over into the garden and go, oh man, what are you feeding your plants? It's kind of like, someone who sees a big growth spurt in a kid and they come over and they're like, oh my God, your kid grew 6 inches in 2 months. What are you feeding them? That's what I love to hear people ask about coming into the garden. And I'm like, I'm feeding the microbiome. I don't know precisely and exactly what they're doing with all of my mulch and all of my organic matter, but I can tell you from the results, it pretty much looks to me like good things. Good things are happening here, the kinds of things that I want. And so, the hidden half of nature is it's a mix of science. There's some history in there. There's some personal memoir, a health challenge I went through that's thankfully behind me, but it really got me asking a lot of questions about the human microbiome and its role in our health. And anytime you have any kind of challenge, I mean, we've talked with a lot of farmers who've had challenges with their soil, and there's nothing like sort of a panic and a crisis and a time in which you really don't know where to turn that is the launch pad for behavior change. And so, in some senses, that book was the story of launching some changes in the garden, in our diet, and those kinds of things. So anybody who wants to know, and the history of science is always really fascinating because you get these quirky characters and they're onto the right thing, and then they take a left turn, and you're like, oh my God, they were so wrong about that. What are we going to do? How are we going to write about this? And then they pick themselves up and they figure it out and they move on. But it's a great book from that standpoint too. It's how much we can learn about where we are now through history.
That's great. And I think something I'd love to learn a little bit more about is how can people begin to build their gut microbiome, and what are some of the benefits of doing that?
Yeah. So when it comes, kind of talked a little bit about this. I bet listeners are kind of maybe thinking about this already. Um, Fiber. So these are plant foods, and I want to be clear here. Human beings, we've evolved to have an omnivorous diet. And so this whole notion that we're some kind of an herbivore that does best on plants and only plants really doesn't match up with human biology. That said, we should always, whether we're eating plant foods or animal foods, be concerned with how they're raised, because all of the things that we talked about before, from soil erosion to nutrients to how the things are getting into plants and animals, is really important. And what microbiomes of the soil and the human gut really like, and this kind of goes back to just look at the expanse of the botanical world on this planet. It's huge and it is diverse. We're slowly chipping away at it, but what that has meant for soil microbes is that they've had access to untold diversity of things to break down into organic matter. The human gut is, quite a bit smaller place, but our microbes also thrive on a diversity of fiber. And what they do after they consume these things, whether in the soil or the gut, they're very transformative. And so uh, the metabolites for example, in the human gut, there's a whole group of things called short chain fatty acids, and there's been quite a bit of research done. They're just these small little molecules, but they actually modulate our immune system. And what it turns out, much of the research is pointing to, is they keep it at the level where we want it, which is to say, kind of nice and low and steady, unless, you get like COVID-19 virus in your body or influenza or something. Then you want to ramp up inflammation. But as soon as that's done, the inflammatory level needs to come back down. And so some of the metabolites that the human microbiome make are modulating our immune system. And then that goes back to diet and why you want to have, not exclusively, but certainly in abundance of fiber in the human diet, and a diversity because we've got a lot of you want to really encourage diversity because you don't want, I mean, I don't know if you said it now or he said it before, so I'll say he said it here. And that is that you never want, a community or a city or something like that to only be filled with shoemakers or guitar players, even though he might
I
like
don't know.
that.
That'd be fun.
He might like that, but it's too simplistic. And so you have this one guild that does this one thing, and then a disaster hits, and the guitar makers and the shoemakers are going,
Damn, we need a drummer.
we have no idea how to fix a car, or we have no idea how to farm, and now look at us. So that's just the value of diversity, is you want to feed it as much as possible in the soil and the gut.
So in 2021, you published an article in Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems, which explored nutrient density in conventional versus organic systems. What are some of the nutritional differences between the two, and why do these differences exist?
Yeah, that paper grew out of all the research we did for What's Your Food Aid, our most recent book that looks at how farming practices, the farming practices we've been talking about, and their impacts on the microbiome, how that affects what gets into our food. And so we basically went, and most of the literature you can find on how do farming practices affect the nutrient density or the composition of what we're eating. Most of those are framed around the question of, well, organic versus conventional, is there a difference? And and we've probably all seen, if you've been reading the media for more than a year or two, you've probably seen the occasional articles that argue one way or the other. Organic food's better for you. Oh, there's no difference between organic and conventional, right? It just seems like it all goes back and forth. So what we did is we got a hold of every paper that we could find that had looked at those kinds of differences, read them, so you don't have to, and tried to synthesize it in terms of, well, what are the patterns here? What do we actually sort of see? And there's a few things that we came away with. One of which is that one of the reasons for a lot of confusion in those studies is that people are using different definitions of what's a nutrient. Is it something that you need to be alive, that if you don't have, you're not going to survive? Or is it something that you need to thrive, that is central to health, but not survival? And so we can think of that in terms of different levels of macronutrients, things we need a lot of because it's the building blocks of building our bodies. And we didn't find a whole lot of evidence that there were systematic differences across all those studies in the macronutrient levels between organic and conventional foods. Sometimes you'd find one study that went one way or the other way, and there's a lot of shall we say, ambiguity to the literature. But what we did find is there was a much more common to find studies that documented differences in the micronutrient concentrations of foods. And what are micronutrients? Those are things like vitamins. Those are things like minerals that we don't need much of. So a micronutrient, we need a little bit of it, but we need a lot. Like take for example, copper. It's really essential for our blood and our immune system. But you can't eat pennies. We don't get copper in a metallic form that isn't of any use to us. And so where do we get it? Well, we need those minerals to get into plants, into organic complexes, so we can then eat them in forms that our bodies can grab that little element of copper and use it for something. And so that we found much more common to find large differences in the micronutrients. And it turns out that those micronutrients are the kinds of things that those microbial symbioses that Anne was describing in the rhizosphere, those are the kind of things that those microbes will get and provide to or liberate from soil particles to make them available to plants. It's that soil biology that's driving that. And the other big difference that we found was that I think it was pretty much every study that had done comparisons that had looked at phytochemical levels, they always found differences of anyway, on average about 20% or so, but sometimes orders of magnitude differences in phytochemicals. And so what are phytochemicals? Plant-made chemical is what phytochemical means. And so these are chemicals that plants are making in response to interactions with soil life in great part. And they're making them for defense, for communication purposes. They make them for their own purposes, but when they get into us, they actually can serve as anti-inflammatories or antioxidants because they have those kinds of properties. So where we sort of came down in that 2021 article was that it looks like there are real differences between foods grown in different kinds of farming systems that reflect differences in how soil life is interacting with the crops to get, in particular, phytochemicals and micronutrients. And there's a term that floats around now in the nutritional literature of phytonutrients, and those would be like phytochemicals that are sort of working as nutrients, but then we're back to the definition of nutrients. The whole point being that it looks like things that can affect our health and that relate to sort of the management of chronic diseases through sort of anti-inflammation and oxidative capacities. Those are the things that farming practices can have a big effect on. And yet, so we did a study for What's Your Food Ate, just a paired farm study of 10 farms around the U.S., where we had them grow the same crops in soils on either a regenerative farm that had rebuilt the fertility of its land using the kind of practices we talked about earlier, the sort of the no-till cover crops and diversity, and a neighboring conventional farm using typical practices for that region. We had them grow the same crops, and we looked at the ratios of things, and we found results that were pretty similar to those differences between organic and conventional, in the sense that the regenerative ones had higher levels of phytochemicals, higher levels of certain vitamins and minerals that are important for human health. And at levels that were substantial enough to think that there's something here in terms of the long-term provisioning of compounds we need to maintain our health, depending on how our food is grown. And that's in great part why we called the book "What Your Food Ate," because we're all, probably know that you are what you eat quote from the 1820s. And we were trying to push it back one step in that chain of causality to think about, okay, well, what we feed our food actually impacts what that food is able to do for us.
Yeah. And, just on the subject of What Your Food Ate, the latest book, one of the sort of the key takeaways that relates to this study that we did with the paired farms. So those were just crops. We didn't have any animal foods that we sampled. But one of the main takeaways in the book is that we call them the Fab Four. So these are groups of again, we're back to the nutrient thing. What is a nutrient? And when we say nutrient, and when you read the book, think of nutrient in its broadest sense. For sure, it is those macromolecules that actually fuel the growth, that gets us from baby to big person. But the other thing is, you want that baby that becomes a big person, all that biomass has got to be taken care of, right? You've got all these cellular processes happening that are generating junk and trash and garbage, I'm sorry to say, inside our bodies, no matter how good our diet. It's just the nature of respiration. There's waste products. We got to get that out of there. We need brooms and vacuum cleaners and all of this stuff to tidy up, to keep the body tidy so that it can function normally. And in large part, this is what the Fab Four, in one way or another, they are part of keeping us operating normally. And so the Fab Four, just to sum up, they are the micronutrients Dave talked about, and they are also the fat balance in our animal foods. And there's a ton of this information in the book about the importance of the ratio between two particular fats, omega-6 fats and omega-3 fats. Right now, they're pretty out of balance in a lot of us, and it has to do with the kinds of things that we're eating in our diet, and it has to do with, in particular, how we feed livestock. So yeah, micronutrients, we got your fat balance, and then on phytochemicals, I just want to say, I don't think we've actually mentioned a phytochemical example here, but that would be beta carotene, that would be lycopene in tomatoes, that would be sulforaphane. That those of us who are wild about kale and brassicas, they're known for their sulforaphane levels. And with respect to my comments earlier about fiber and what they do for the soil microbiome and the gut microbiome, is phytochemicals are actually embedded in fiber, and so our microbes are fermenting these phytochemicals as well. And what we know comes out of that is the last four, the Fab Four, and that is these microbial metabolites. And so I mentioned the short chain fatty acids. There's all kinds of things flying back and forth in the soil between crop microbiome and its plant host. And all of these microbial metabolites, just kind of remember, okay, we got M for microbe, M for metabolite. Oh, M for medicinal. Yes. So that's what a lot of these microbial metabolites are doing. And by and large, there were big differences in those four things, depending on what farming practices are and depending on how we raise our animals. And that all circles back with and works, for better and for worse, with human biology, plant biology, pretty much any organism out there.
Yeah, and essentially what I sort of think of the takeaway bottom line on all that we came away from writing What Your Food Ate With is that, when we look at agriculture and medicine, we often think of them as separate fields. And yet what we were finding is that, what's good for the land is actually good for us too. They converge.
Way to bring that back to environmental planning. I like that.
Go.
Yeah.
Yeah, big scale environmental planning.
I love it. Are there any other things you would like to share? Any discoveries in agriculture or medicine related to soil, or any final thoughts before we close?
Well, there's a lot in What Your Food Ate that really tries to tie that all together and make the case for why, we really ought to be thinking about agricultural policy as health policy, because these areas are far more linked than we give them credit for in public discourse and in the sciences. And if we obviously recommend all the books if you're interested in those kind of areas. Start with What Your Food Ate. It's a good intro. It has the benefit of all we've learned from writing the other three books. And we've got a website, Dig to Grow, digtogrow.com, that if people want to look at a preview or sort of understand what's in the different books, or reach out and contact us. You can email us through the website. And we are the staff. It comes to one of us.
Yeah. Sometimes he's chief staff and sometimes I'm chief staff. Depends. I think the other thing that I would just say, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a real kind of hands-on doer person. And so I always like to leave people with this thought and get them thinking about parallels between the gut and soil. And so I'll leave you with this. Mulch your soil inside and out.
All right, everybody who's listening, mulch your soil. Thank you so much for joining today. This has been super fun. You guys both have a ton of energy, and it's great to hear about all the amazing books you've written. So thank you, and have an awesome day.
Yeah, our pleasure. Thank you.
No worries. Thanks. Cheers.